Hi, everybody, and welcome back to the Popular Music Books in Process series, a joint project between the U.S. chapter of the International Association for the Study of Popular Music, the Journal of Popular Music Studies, and the Pop Conference. I'm Alex Vizi, one of the series organizers, along with Kimberly Mack, Elena Rozlakova, Francesca Royster, Gus Statler, Eric Weisbard, and Carl Wilson. You can find our whole calendar on the IASPM website under the Journal tab. You can also catch up on videos of all of our past sessions on Eric's YouTube channel. In our latest session, Vanessa Diaz and Petra Rivera-Rideau spoke with NPR's Anna Maria Sayer about their new book on Bad Bunny. We will return Wednesday, February 4th at 5:30 p.m. Eastern for a conversation between Jonathan Bernstein and Robert Morast on Justin Townes Earle and Cowpunk. But everybody knows we're here to talk about Leonard Cohen today. David Shumway is the editor of The World of Leonard Cohen, a serious but engaging exploration on the various dimensions of the artist's life, work, persona, and legacy by scholars and writers who are among the best qualified to undertake this project. Shumway is professor of English and Literary and Cultural Studies at Carnegie Mellon University. His most recent book is Rockstar: The Making of Musical Icons from Elvis to Springsteen. He has also written Michel Foucault, Creating American Civilization, a genealogy of American literature as an academic discipline, Modern Love, Romance, Intimacy, and the Marriage Crisis, and John Sayles. He has recently published a book on realism across media in 20th century America and is currently working on an institutional history of theory and literary studies. He is joined by three leading Leonard Cohen experts who contributed to this collection. Sarah Hill is Associate Professor of Popular Music and Fellow of St. Peter's College, University of Oxford. She is coordinating editor of the journal Popular Music and has published on popular music historiography, popular music and politics, and popular music and cultural identity, particularly as it relates to the Welsh language. Her most recent books are the monograph San Francisco and the Long 60s and the edited collection One Hit Wonders, An Oblique History of Popular Music. Erin MacLeod is the author of Visions of Zion, Ethiopians and Rastafari in the Search for the Promised Land, and co-editor with Moji Anderson of Beyond Homophobia, Centering LGBTQ Experiences in the Anglophone Caribbean. She holds a PhD in communications from McGill University and a master's in English literature from the University of Toronto, and has taught and lectured at both the college and university levels in Ethiopia, Canada, and Jamaica. Her writing has appeared in international publications such as the New York Times, The Guardian, NPR, Pitchfork, Rolling Stone, and many others. Erin teaches at Vanier College in Montreal, Canada, and works as a consultant in international development. And finally, Eric Weisbard is professor of American Studies at the University of Alabama. His books as an editor and author include The Spin Alternative Record Guide, This Is Pop, Use Your Illusion 1 and 2, Top 40 Democracy, The Rival Mainstreams of American Music, Songbooks, The Literature of American Popular Music, and Hound Dog. He co-founded the Pop Conference, co-edited Journal of Popular Music Studies, and was the Village Voice's music editor. He is currently editing the Oxford Handbook of Pop Music. During their conversation, please post your questions as you think of them in the chat, and in the last part of the session, Carl will call on you to unmute and ask your questions during the Q&A. And of course, we also encourage you to use the chat for comments and conversation throughout this afternoon's conversation. And now, David, Sarah, Erin, and Eric.
Well, hi, welcome. So glad to see so many people interested in Leonard Cohen. I have the book here. It actually exists, although apparently it's not easy to come by as yet. The press is still in the process of shipping it. Official publication actually isn't until I think January 29th, although you can order it online. So the book is the second volume in presumably what will be a continuing series from Cambridge. The first volume in the series was The World of Bob Dylan, published in 2022. And the volume is an attempt to get at Cohen from as many different angles as we could reasonably imagine. The author list is stellar. It includes Ira Nadel, who wrote the first significant biography of Cohen, Alan Light, whose book about Hallelujah was the basis for then a documentary film about Cohen and the song, Anthony de Curtis, the leading rock critics in the United States, Ray Padgett, who wrote the forget the name of the series, the 33 and a third book about the cover album about Cohen, and then the esteemed people here. So it's a really I think astonishing lineup. I was gratified that so many people were interested in contributing. Um, what I discovered editing this volume is how complicated and um, untransparent Leonard Cohen is as a subject. I thought I knew him when I started doing it, and I've learned, of course, a great deal more by editing. But the title of my introduction to the volume is You Don't Know Leonard Cohen. And while I think you will know him better if you read the book, you still won't know him completely after reading it because he's an enigma in many respects. Um, so maybe I could turn it over to Eric to talk a little bit about his contribution to the volume.
Oh, me first? Okay.
Yeah.
I had to wait for a second to be clear with the pronoun if you'd said Eric or Erin. So I've definitely hit that moment in life. Yeah. So everybody comes at Leonard Cohen a little differently, but I sort of come to him through um, an album from the 70s called Songs of Love and Hate and the song Avalanche there, and how it was then later taken up by one of the people I played to death on college radio in my college radio days, Nick Cave. And so I wanted to think about how Leonard Cohen, as Lou Reed famously made fun of him at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction, had virtually no rock and roll in him, and yet has been a touchstone figure for rockers across multiple generations. Um, and so what I ended up thinking about was in the initial rock era, the long songs that Cohen put into circulation were not only, in a sense, a continuation of a door that maybe Dylan had opened the way the world of Leonard Cohen follows on the world of Bob Dylan. Um, they were extensions of popular front culture. They were extensions of a notion that you could totally date back to the 1930s of cabaret blues, as one scholar calls it, and Michael Denning, that is. Over time, for figures like Nick Cave, those kinds of odd, rambling, politically committed, but also politically embittered, um, above it all and compromised by it all kinds of songs ended up feeling as substantial as making an unholy racket with your guitar. And so the first version of this Leonard Cohen story is that. But then it turned out that Cohn never really stopped having a relationship to rock music for all of his inability to rock himself. He famously talked about his one chop version of sort of quasi flamenco, and then later his cheap keyboard version of music. Um, in the era of my college radio days, um, the kinds of stuff that inspired the songs on the I'm Your Fan collection that Ray Padgett wrote a 33 and a third about. Um, that was the notion that Cohn, in his standing out from the norm of singer-songwriters, was inherently part of the alternative rock world. We have an entry for him and not an entry for Bob Dylan in the Spin Alternative Record Guide. Most recently, just to do a lot of work quickly, you see Leonard Cohen propping up as a figure to be made fun of by emergent women rockers. So Boy Genius have a song making fun of Leonard Cohen, and many others have followed. I can't remember if Olivia Rodrigo is one of them. I have it all in the book, but not in my head apparently. So that's my sort of topic, how this guy who had no rock and roll apparently in him has been a figure by which some version of rock aligns itself for going on 50 plus years.
Thanks. Sarah.
Yeah, this is I don't have the college radio, sort of cred. Like I don't actually remember being young and engaging at all with Leonard Cohen. Like he kind of he's always been sort of a bit of a mystery to me, a bit of an enigma. Um and I was doing some work, I don't know, maybe 20 years ago, on the San Francisco counterculture. And around then, I was back home in the Bay Area interviewing old hippies for basically a radio program and for, a book, the thing that became a book. And the first person that I interviewed was a woman named Teresa Taduri, who kind of is like this little shadow of the whole of the 60s in the Haight-Ashbury. So she was like there at the cusp. She did the folk thing and the coffee house thing, and she knew Janis Joplin and blah blah blah. And she's like, you know, a blues woman, but also did this, blah, blah. So she has this story that kind of echoes a lot of the bigger narratives of the 60s. Um, and I mentioned her because one of the things that she said in that interview with me, she had gone through kind of a traumatic, she had a traumatic 60s, like a lot of the women that I talked to about their experiences as young, flower children. And her particular trauma sent her out of San Francisco and into kind of the European wilderness. So she took off, for Europe, spent a couple of years wandering around Europe, and then she just kind of said offhandedly in this interview, and then I met up with Leonard and he brought me back home. I was like, "Who's Leonard?" She's like, "Leonard Cohen." And it's like I'm kind of imagining her as a, 19-year-old, 18-year-old, like traumatized 19, 20-year-old, and Leonard Cohen, who is a bit older, sort of like taking her under his wing and making sure that she got back to the States safely. And she's also like, and Robert Graves, I'm like, I Claudius, Robert Graves. So she's like her references were all over the place. It was really fascinating. So it got me thinking about like back then about Leonard Cohen and the counterculture in the sense of he always pops up where you least expect him. And that's the thing I found really fascinating about him. So when David invited me to take part in the book, I thought, well, actually, I could kind of think a little bit about what it meant to be, countercultural or like a hippie, or what are the sort of the tropes about hippiedom and 60s that Cohen actually, tangles up even further in our kind of understanding of the time. And it's like Eric said, the closer you get to some truth, it's like he just like throws a wrench in it and it makes you kind of rethink, well, what am I actually looking for here? So he's very, very slippery, and I found that really, kind of intriguing. And my sort of the thing I really wanted to find out a little bit more about was um, what really happened with Janis Joplin in the Chelsea Hotel. And so it's like I tried to sort of trace the little points of contact that he had with the counterculture. And it was like revealing for a lot of different reasons, and particularly to sort of send me back to that interview that I took with Teresa back in, 2006. So that's me.
Thanks. Erin.
Hi. Well, I think that the this kind of running theme of the slipperiness of Leonard Cohen and the wrench he throws in things continues with what my essay deals with. This essay initially kind of came from some thinking that I'd been doing about I mean, like any other Canadian, about issues of identity and, what does it mean to be from Canada? What does it mean to be from Toronto, from Montreal, etc. And I wrote an essay for CBC making the argument basically what Drake is to Toronto, Leonard Cohen is to Montreal. And I know it was a little bit controversial because people didn't like me to speak about Drake and Cohen in the same sentence. But really, what that was trying to deal with was how these particular figures, given the anxieties around identity that Canadians tend to feel, how they kind of come to be iconic representations of these cities and Cohen in particular. It also drew from my experience as an undergraduate in Montreal in the early to mid 90s, and basically being told that the only way to really become a Montrealer is to run into Leonard Cohen on the street. And that always has stuck with me. And being in Montreal during the time of the 1995 referendum on separation, this was a particularly sort of fraught moment for these kinds of ideas of what it means to belong in a particular space. So my piece kind of deals with that, this idea of what Montreal meant to Cohen, and then what Cohen means to Montreal, kind of coming to the conclusion that it's very difficult to really gain a sense of what Cohen felt about Montreal and his relationship to the city, his relationship to the space where he grew up. He, in fact, didn't really grow up in Montreal. He grew up in Westmount, which is a place that is within the island of Montreal, but very much its own municipality and stubbornly its own Anglophone, quite wealthy municipality. And so growing up sort of as an outsider and then coming to represent this iconic Montrealer, looking at his lyrics, if you want to go back to Drake, Drake doesn't really stop talking about Toronto, but Cohen doesn't really talk a lot about Montreal in his work. More, I suppose, in his novels and his poetry, but even then, it's somewhat limited. And in addition to kind of talking about his famous comments about returning to Montreal to renew his neurotic affiliations, I also looked into this quotation that kept coming up about his feelings for Montreal. Specifically, I feel at home when I'm in Montreal in a way that I don't feel anywhere else. I don't know what it is, but the feeling gets stronger as I get older. This is a quotation that appears in many different places. Journalistically, it appears in tourist information about Montreal, and there is absolutely no way of attributing this to Leonard Cohen. Everyone says it comes from somewhere else. Everyone thinks that they've heard it, but they haven't. And so this fellow who represents the ultimate Montrealer is someone whose own relationship with the city is very difficult to parse. And in my piece, I kind of talk about how that's kind of perfect for Montreal because many of us who live in this city find our own relationship with the city difficult to parse, and the sort of recent political realities of what it means to be in Quebec, be it both Anglophone or Francophone, and live in Montreal, where the city is kind of a state unto itself. And there's a lot of issues that have come up between the wider Quebec and Montreal. It kind of seems that this individual, Leonard Cohen, is this person that appears to be able to kind of be, I guess, sort of a philosopher of the in-between of this tension of negotiating belonging. So that's really what I tried to talk about, especially as I guess, Montrealer who always says things like, I guess Montrealer, even though I've lived here for almost 30 years.
Oh, let me talk a little bit about I have two essays in the volume besides my introduction. One of them deals with Leonard Cohen's relationship to the singer-songwriters of the early 70s. I argue that Cohen is foundational to that movement, but not really of it, because I understand that movement as fundamentally confessional. And I think Leonard Cohen is not either a confessional poet or a confessional songwriter. He does, of course, famously draw on some instances of autobiography. Um, Janis Joplin just came up, and that's maybe the most notorious instance. But even Chelsea Hotel number two is not really a confession. In fact, it might be a boast. Um, it and it's more about Janis than it is about him. And that's actually characteristic of his songs. He writes about people in his life, but he writes about them. Suzanne is a song about Suzanne. It's not a song about Leonard Cohen, which distinguishes him from, say, James Taylor, who also writes about a Suzanne in Fire and Rain, but Fire and Rain is not about her. It's about James, about his suffering. And that, of course, the other point about Leonard's songs. I mean, we know him to be someone who had problems with substances, who was depressed a lot of his life, and yet he doesn't really write about those things in his lyrics. I mean, it's ironic that he's known. I mean, Rolling Stone called him, a depressing. His songs depressing. I think after his third album, but the songs themselves are not about depression, even if they are serious and maybe not joyful. So unlike, say, Blue, which really is an album in very many respects about depression, there really isn't in Cohen's canon a body of material that deals with his own problems in that way. He's much more interested in philosophical and theological generalities. I mean, he wants to get at bigger truths rather than at it seems to me his own personal issues in his songwriting and in his poetry. The other essay that I contributed is called "How to Be an Aged Rock Star." I think, by the way, that Cohen is a rock star even if he doesn't perform rock music. He enters the musical world exactly at the moment when rock and roll defined how popular music artists presented themselves. And he continues to inhabit that world throughout the rest of his career. But what's astonishing to me is that beginning when he had to return to touring in 2009 as a result of his manager stealing all his money, that he really, I think, comes into his own as a performer. I think those performances on the late tours are the pinnacle of him as a live performer, and among the best recordings. The live recordings of those performances are among the best things he produced. But also, unlike other old popular musicians who were touring around the same time, Cohen presents himself as an old man. He doesn't pretend to be a 30-year-old like, say, Mick Jagger continues to do. And, it's great that Jagger can do it successfully, that he's still able to shake it in his 80s, or at least the last time he was on tour, he could. But Cohen took a different approach, which was to embrace aging and to present himself as someone who was the 70-year-old that he was. To me, this is incredibly important because we live in a culture where ageism uh, is one of the last acceptable prejudices. And Cohen's insistence that he present himself as the old man that he was seems to be um, a rejection of that prejudice. Um, so yeah, I'd love to hear from other people. Eric, did
Mhm.
you,
You want me to argue with you? I could argue with you a little bit.
if you'd like to, I'd love to be argued with.
As Sarah knows well, I know I love nothing better. So hopefully will get everyone in. Um, I think that maybe it's more of a mixed picture than you're portraying. One of the first songs that drew me in by Leonard Cohen was called Dress Rehearsal Rag. And if it's not a song about being depressed and thinking about suicide, it's doing an awful lot of work to convince you it's a song about being depressed and committing suicide. Um, I always felt like there was a quality of the confessional mixed in with a quality of the prophetic and the poetic. Um, it was less that it was absolutely telling a coherent story of traveling through this moment or traveling through that moment, as that the sense of Cohn as being two things in particular, depressed and really horny, sort of carried through the music in an autobiographical way. So, on the one hand, he was like not too much of a learned scholar to resist being a horn dog. And then on the other side, he was not so much of a portraitist that he wasn't capable of putting his own reaction shots into the song. And I think that to a certain extent, that also is part of the question of why he aged well. I too loved the chance I got to see him play one of those 3 hour sets in the last stages of his life, and his ability to jump onto his knees and get back up again was positively, tub thumpian. But I think that what was partly going on there was that he constantly acknowledged in himself a set of urges that were not as different than Mick Jagger as we might think. Yeah, he wasn't doing Brown Sugar, but he was absolutely singing about similar kinds of topics. And so I think in both these cases there's room to play, and maybe that's part of what we enjoy about Leonard Cohen and what keeps us going with Leonard Cohen is that there is a kind of multiplicity in play. I'll stop there. Gentle arguing.
So dress rehearsal rag is a very good counterexample. I will admit. But it's also, of course, not one of the songs for which he is most well known. Um, and I guess um, I would need to think about the way the song is put together more carefully than I have to maybe come back more strongly than I can right now. But you're certainly right that its subject matter is suicide and depression. Um, so yeah, I appreciate that. But I do think there's something fundamentally different about the way Cohen is presenting himself on those late tours than almost anyone else in a similar situation. I mean, Dylan, for example, um, doesn't, of course, deny his age, but he kind of actually, I think, shrinks in a certain way in his current performances. What's striking about Leonard in those late performances is how present he is, how genuinely in the moment and the center of attention, and you know, and I don't know, performing so well. I mean, Dylan does occasionally do apparently some great shows, but it's certainly been a mixed bag for some time. Whereas if you look at the run of these shows that Leonard did, they were, I mean, from all accounts, consistently great.
Yeah, I agree with all that for sure. Should Joni Mitchell ever find the energy, I think the audience is equally large, but we're not in a position to assume that. Just hope for it.
Yes.
I'll sort of jump in because I saw one of those later tours in 2013 something in Cardiff. And the thing that struck me is, how gracious a performer he was. So there was so much intimate and, loving dialogue between him and his backing, him and his band. And that's not something you would ever say about Dylan, probably. You know, Dylan gives nothing to the audience or to his musicians. It's like, okay, I'm done. I'm going to do something else. But everything, you just felt like watching Leonard Cohen at the age of whatever he was then, um, you couldn't help but get the sense that he was, appreciating every moment that he had to make music at that stage in his life. And just the kind of the opportunity to have these, wonderful moments with great musicians. Um, the thing that's so striking about him, and your idea of the aging voice is so interesting because he has always been an old man, right? He's like always been an old voice and kind of it gives projects this idea of himself as, or we project onto him the idea that he's an old soul. He's sort of, you know, a big thinker and a large liver and all, not liver, but somebody who lives large. Probably had a large liver at some point in his life. Um, but it's that thing of kind of going, of making you reassess what you think you understand about him. So, all of the things that you say that he was kind of he was worldwise and he had all this experience that he brought to even those early albums. Just watching him kind of embody that music later on, it's like everything meant something different. In the same way that watching Joni Mitchell now is like, you know, she has a totally different presence and sense of her body and her music. And I think Leonard Cohen always kind of had that in some way.
I just want to say something again, like sort of, I'll take a cue from Eric, and I'll push back a little bit on this idea of Leonard Cohen's agedness. Um, I feel that, I came to Cohen from being a student at McGill and learning about him having been a student at McGill and watching the National Film Board documentary, Ladies and Gentlemen, Introducing Leonard Cohen, which that was the image of Cohen on the cover of the book is the image of Cohen for me that I was introduced to, the Cohen of the Spice Box of the Earth, of Beautiful Losers. This is the Cohen that then he obviously did age over time, but the Cohen singing Suzanne was not an old man, and he was just as, and this is something that I try to address in the essay, that he sort of spoke to the pretentious English lit undergrad that I was, because he was a pretentious English lit undergrad. And that kind of over serious, I want to be famous type of attitude seems to me really quite youthful. And so for me, the picture that's on the buildings in Montreal, it's this picture of this like old man in a hat. And that was not really my vision of Leonard Cohen. Is I wanted to kind of be like him as a young person. And I feel that maybe this kind of goes to, I think it's Carl who asked the question about the difference between potentially like the US view of Leonard Cohen and kind of like the wider view and different views of Leonard Cohen, is that I think that definitely within Canada, this idea of him being this eternally old man was less of a reality because of his position of being kind of this young upstart in Canadian literature, when Canadian literature was really being sort of developed as an idea in the 1960s.
And let's throw in there just for fun. If I could go back and see Leonard Cohen in a phase, it would be in Europe in the 1970s when he's more popular in Europe than in the US. And I'd be very curious to sort of get a sense of just how out there it got. Because I do think that um, that notion of Europe is another sort of lodestar in the Leonard Cohen um, cosmology. There's Greece as a place to find yourself outside of Canada, but in a broader sense, I think there's a European notion of putting on a concert and being confident that a rock-sized audience will listen in a way that inherits the legacy of a cabaret audience. And even now, when I saw PJ Harvey play in Oslo, Norway a couple of years ago, I was like, this is different than when I saw PJ Harvey in San Francisco. There's assumptions about role of artist, role of audience that are changed. And so I am curious about the European side of Leonard Cohen. Is that addressed anywhere in this book, David?
It is not.
Damn.
It is a very interesting subject. I was on Leonard as an older figure. I mean, of course, it comes from, in the U.S. context, the fact that he starts recording after he's 30, at a time when the dominant slogan was "Don't trust anyone over 30." But I agree that side of him was to some extent has been overplayed. I mean, if you look at the picture on the cover of the book, it reminds you of Dustin Hoffman in The Graduate, who was another image of youth at that very moment, even though Hoffman himself was around 30 when he played Benjamin Braddock. So part of it has to do, of course, with the fact that he wore a suit all the time, that his hair was shorter than virtually any other male popular singer at the moment. All of that made him seem more mature, and yet he certainly had a kind of attraction that was not purely rooted in maturity. He was a handsome young man when he started recording, to be sure. I think it probably should be time to turn to the Q&A.
That's Carl, I think,
Yeah,
unless you got distracted.
I was just momentarily distracted because I wasn't expecting that at that moment. So yeah, we only have a couple of questions so far, so people should keep indicating in the chat if they have questions. But the first one we have is from Anna. If you want to unmute and ask your question about confessional there. Anna Samir?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, yes, it struck me that there are several songs that seemed to me very, very confessional, like A Bird on a Wire. And what was the other one I wrote? Even Famous Raincoat has a lot of confessional elements to it. So I don't know. I mean, some of these confessional songs are more complicated than they seem. Like the Famous Raincoat has two personas. One is an imaginary himself, and the real one, or maybe it's kind of the two sides of his persona. So it's kind of a tricky song. But Bird on a Wire is a very straightforward confessional, right? I want to say professional, confessional um, lyrics to me.
So when I speak of confessional songwriting and poetry, I'm referring to the way in which it has been defined in primarily in literary criticism about figures like Robert Lowell and Sylvia Plath and Anne Sexton. The basic premise is that of direct address from the poet to the audience, which in poetry was important because of the idea of the poetic speaker that had been the dominant way of conceiving poems in the modernist era. And Lowell and Plath and other people of that moment did away with that fiction of the speaker and just said, "This is me talking about myself." And I argue that people like Jackson Browne and James Taylor and Joni Mitchell are doing the same thing in many of their songs. So it seems to me the famous Blue Raincoat is actually not doing that, that it is because it sets up this dual conversation. Critics argue about whether it's Cohen talking to another version of himself or, it's not clear exactly, but it is in fact seemingly not direct address. It is complicating the address from the songwriter to the audience.
How about Bird on the Wire, if I may ask?
Well, so I
Think of
mean,
that.
I guess if the confession is I've tried in my way to be free, um, I suppose, but the examples in the song seem to me not personal, like a bird on a wire, like a drunk in some old midnight choir. These are kind of broadly cultural touchstones, not incidents in Leonard's life. But I mean, I should also say, I don't mean to deny that there aren't some confessional elements in Cohen's writing. It's not that I'm saying he completely abjures that. There are moments of confession. I just think that they're less dominant than in these other singer-songwriters.
It gets
How
awfully
would you?
tricky. It gets awfully tricky all these decades later, doesn't it? I mean, last time I saw Richard was what, Detroit in 68. It's 4 in the morning, the end of September. I'm writing you now just to see if you're better. New York is cold, but I like where I'm living. There's music on Clinton Street all through the evening. I mean, that feels like it's purporting to be the record of experience. And as we know from Tangled Up in Blue and other examples, experience in the hands of a songwriter can be kaleidoscopic, just like perspective in the hands of a painter. I worry that if we get too hung up on the question of some artistically lesser ideal of confessional songwriting in the that we miss the larger point of songwriting, which in the hands of sort of figures like Joni Mitchell, Bob Dylan, and Leonard Cohen, um, just, can paint in a lot of different ways, to mix metaphors.
Anyone else on that before we move on? Okay, cool. My question was second, and it's already been addressed to some degree, but I wanted to go back to it just to a little degree because I think along with that question of sort of the presence of Europe in his work and as an influence in his style, I think, from a Canadian perspective and from a European perspective, it feels like Americans don't know Leonard Cohen as well as the rest of the world does in a lot of ways, and particularly around the themes of his interaction with the counterculture and his role in those kinds of things. It feels like if you look at his work um, documented in the time. I'm thinking particularly of the documentary of the Isle of Wight Festival, playing that. There's a lot of footage of him participating very heavily in the counterculture and seeming like a player in it. In a slightly elder statesman player, for sure. But he wasn't invited to do things like that in America, it seems to me, and so that distanced the American perception of his um, relationship to the counterculture in that time. And I just wonder if maybe that's part of what's going on in some of this sense of slipperiness is the partiality of the view that the American music industry allowed of him at the time.
I'd say that's a really good framework. I think it's really true. Like I said earlier that I don't remember really knowing much about him or hearing him much when I was growing up. And it was when I moved to Britain many years ago that people were like rabid about him. I mean, just this kind of the sense of, this is the guy. Like, why aren't you listening to this guy? Oh, you're depressed. You should listen to Leonard Cohen, or like I don't know, like I felt like there was this kind of cultural moment that I had missed somehow. Having like known about him or whatever, but also kind of in my mind feeling like he was the guy, in Animal House, the folk singer, Bob, my love, a chair, that thing. Like I always thought that that's who Leonard Cohen was. Like that he was the one they were lampooning there. Um, because like, oh, really earnest and, whatever the kind of dismissive adjectives a person might have about, a singer-songwriter in the 60s and the 70s who wasn't James Taylor, Bob Dylan, whoever. Um, so, and I'm not speaking for all US Ians when I say this, but I think it's just a thing about, oh yeah, Canada exists too. Like forgetting that Canada is up there is part of it. So if there's a singer who's like markedly Canadian, it's like, oh, good for him. It's sort of the sort of sense that, good for you. You can do that too. But we're looking kind of beyond our northern border. It's like this weird sort of sense of, we're central and you're not. So we're going to decide whether you can play with the big guys. That's totally overstating everything, and I don't mean to offend. But I will say it's absolutely true that I the deeper knowledge that people in Britain have about Leonard Cohen than I had ever encountered before was actually, it still kind of amazes me. I found it really remarkable and amazing.
I just want to mention, now that Animal House has been mentioned, mention the use of Leonard Cohen in the song Everybody Knows at the beginning of Pump Up the Volume. I should say, full disclosure, Alan Moyle, the writer-director of Pump Up the Volume, is my cousin. So I have talked to him about the use of this song, and he's very open about the fact that that was his choice. He wanted that because he sort of grew up in Franco, Ontario, which is where my dad's family's from, and came to Montreal, and that's where he sort of became a bit of an avant-garde filmmaker, and then went to Hollywood after his failure with the film Times Square, which has sort of become a bit of a cult classic since then. But with Pump Up the Volume, this was this attempt to really speak to young people. And he fought to use the Leonard Cohen song, even though it was very evident that young people would not be listening to Leonard Cohen. Um, that being said, I mean, I see it as a pretty iconic scene, at the beginning, and it does really incredibly fit with Hard Harry's persona, and it is, a scene that I remember, and I would imagine, based on the popularity of the soundtrack, that a lot of people throughout North America that really spoke to, even though the song didn't actually appear on the soundtrack. It was the Pretenders version, I believe, if I remember correctly. Anyways, but
It gets a whole page in my chapter, by the way.
yes, yeah, yeah.
So
So
Happy
I mean,
Harry Hard-On is represented in this book.
and I do think that that was a really sort of important needle drop for Leonard Cohen within sort of the universe of American youth culture to have that there. And it really was Moyle's desire to kind of just give a hat tip to Montreal. That was the point of that, and then I think it kind of grew from there. And then, of course, increasingly in the 1990s, Leonard Cohen having, we talked about the I'm Your Fan compilation, this sort of renewed popularity amongst kind of Gen X listeners.
I have one other little Alan Moyle point to throw in there from this page, which is I'm recounting this needle drop, which is literally a needle drop. You see, have Harry put the needle on the vinyl, and it's also the credit sequence. And so the attribution written and directed by Alan Moyle comes during the line of Cohen's that reverts social retrenchment back to sexual betrayal with a cuckold's bravado. Everybody knows that you've been faithful, give or take a night or two. That was where Moyle wanted to insert himself into the narrative.
That's great. I'm feel covered with shame that I didn't even know that Moyle was Canadian. So thanks for that, Erin. The mention of Animal House also sets up our next question pretty well, which is from Michael Barkley.
Animal House, really?
The parody of the folk singer and all that.
I just want to say 1,000% to the last conversation that literal needle drop and Pump Up the Volume was very formative to me. And it was Concrete Blonde, who I think actually did a great version. But as a Gen Xer whose first album I heard was I'm Your Man, my knowledge of Leonard Cohen before that was all my parents' friends loved the Jennifer Warnes record, which I think was a huge pop hit. I don't know if it was definitely in Canada for sure. And I think for a lot of Canadians who feel culturally mandated to embrace our artists who do anything remotely well outside the country, they're always confused by Leonard Cohen. And then I feel like Jennifer Warnes made it okay for normal middle class people to like Leonard Cohen. But that immediately after that record was I'm Your Man. And on the cover, there's him peeling a banana and looking ridiculous. And I remember the discourse at the time being like, oh, hey, this pretentious suicidal poet has a sense of humor. And if Various Positions was kind of critically reviled at the time, all the hesitations about all the sequencing and the synthesizers seemed to evaporate with I'm Your Man because it was just so fucking good. The songs are incredible on that record. But there's that sense of humor, both from the cover image through to so many of the lyrics on the record. I can't remember, I can't forget. I'm forgetting the lyrics to the song about forgetting. The song I'm Your Man is hilarious. Like there's so many jokes on that record in ways that I don't think any of his peers did. I mean, Paul Simon does a little bit. Neil Young's not funny. Bob Dylan's definitely not funny to me. I don't know. Maybe he is to others. But I just feel like there's a humor there, a self-deprecation that I think endeared him to Gen X audiences and beyond that is not there among his other peers. And I'm curious what the role of humor, I think, plays in his appeal and what people make of that.
Well, I think it's an excellent point that Cohen does have a sense of humor. Um, and I think it was there even on the early albums, but it's maybe harder to perceive because the albums were understood as being so serious. But self-deprecation is Leonard. Basically, it runs throughout his oeuvre, both in songs and poetry. Not always humorously. I mean, you can deprecate yourself seriously, and he did. Um, but I also think Dylan certainly can be funny, and Joni Mitchell is funny in places. So I'm not sure he's unique in that, but it's certainly a great point that humor is a very um, significant element, and maybe it is more significant as he gets older.
I think he has zingers that his peers don't have. Others might be funny in their themes or their overall, but Leonard Cohen has, what Stephen Merritt has. He has some lines that just make you laugh out loud sometimes, in ways that I don't think his peers do.
I was born with the gift of a golden voice.
And that element of humor was so integral to those later shows too. Like there were so many punchlines, and the audience would, and it's the juxtaposition, I think, of the very serious, the deep philosophical poet with the humor that I think is what makes him so singular among that generation and beyond.
But the way that he would skip off stage in those late shows, did he ever skip around as a young man? Or was that something that he kind of, you know, because that was like an embodiment of the sort of, the sense of joy and sense of, fun, I suppose.
I don't recall any images of him skipping from earlier shows.
I think that I would sort of reinforce and slightly reframe Michael's point, which is that and agree this time with David, because Leonard Cohen understood that he was a little bit ridiculous from the beginning. There was always a musical way he indicated that he was in on the joke at some point in the song. Sometimes it was lyrical, sometimes it was how he made his voice do some kind of curtsy for you in the midst of an otherwise narrative moment. Um, but in different fashions, it was always there. And then I think that as he became Grandpa Leonard, or whatever he was at the end, um, then yeah, there was more room going back to sort of the everybody knows Tower of Song shift for it to become that he was now not a figure who stuck out in the 60s counterculture. He was a figure from the left behind left in general of the 20th century. And so he sort of changed the nature of what he felt sheepish about. But throughout the work, there are these deflections that are sort of there to undercut the seriousness, to show he had a sense of humor, but above all, to just make clear that, as Dylan would say, I just don't fit.
Yeah, and I'd just add in relation to Michael's point there too that the production shift really does a lot to help that. That it was hard for the humor to get through the like flamenco guitar and orchestrations and choirs and all of that of the early music, and then the spareness of the synthesizer music really really let that personality shift kind of come to the forward. Um, we have a question from Elena next.
Hi. I think a lot of the ground of the question has been covered by people who talked about appropriations, but I'm just wondering whether cultural appropriation of Leonard Cohen is maybe more important in some way that what his songs and what his intentions were really about. And especially as a Montrealer, just remembering what happened after he died and how it was 5 times more energy spent on thinking about what he was about. Besides murals that Erin mentioned, there were 5 concerts of local musicians covering his songs, a museum exhibit at the Contemporary Museum with Janet Cardiff doing pieces, and a lot of others that lasted forever. And so that's the question for Erin more like, do you feel like there's a different type of commemoration of his work since he left, since he died in Montreal? And then thinking about covers more, they're just more. I'm just thinking how many different musicians covered his songs, and Laibach's "The Future" is my favorite because I'm actually Slavic. But Nina Simone doing Suzanne, or Jeff Buckley having a bestseller with Hallelujah. It's just so many diverse people finding some kind of personal relationship with him, and also his voice is so distinct, and yet he's covered so much, and people love the covers as well. So that's my kind of question, open-ended.
I mean, I'll speak a little bit to the kind of the responses to his his death, and then also the subsequent exhibitions. When we were at MLA a couple of weeks ago, one of the other writers who's in the book, Jim Shedden, who's he works at the Art Gallery of Ontario, is a curator, publisher, etc. He spoke to, the way that different elements of the Cohen exhibitions had to be developed or altered. And one of the things that I think about the ones that were in Montreal is that there was absolutely zero attempt, and this is, there are advantages to this approach. There was zero attempt to provide any information about Leonard Cohen. It was just an accepted thing that if you're going to go to the Musée d'Art Contemporain to see the exhibit, to see the artworks, etc., you're in because you know Cohen. That's it. You're there for that reason. There wasn't this sense that there's any need to explain who he is, what he represents, etc. It's just an accepted thing that you're in Montreal, you love him, you're going to go and see it, and yay. Which is, I mean, I don't really have a problem with that because I love Leonard Cohen, but I think that that sort of sense of, not of engaging with Cohen through interpreting him, rather than engaging with Cohen through some kind of like analysis of his work or who he is, etc. It's almost like the lack of ability to kind of answer some of the questions that I think Sarah mentioned, as well as Eric, just how this confusion that we might have, who is he, etc., is answered through the versioning of his work in some ways. It's another tactic at kind of trying to get to who or what Cohen was. I don't know if that answered the question, but that's just sort of a thought that I had.
True. And it worked. I think so many people came in
Yes.
Montreal, totally worked that approach.
I can speak a little bit to the covers, or to the fact that, I mean, Cohen later, so it starts, of course, with the fact that Judy Collins records Suzanne before he does. which makes it not even really a cover. And to some extent, he's a songwriter in the way that very few of his peers were at that time. I mean, so Joni Mitchell, for example, now is last few decades was covered by everybody, but it took a long time for her songs to be widely covered. They were regarded in the beginning, I think, as too personal. But Cohen's were not. Cohen's clearly were understood to be available to other people to interpret. Dylan describes him as being like Irving Berlin, and I think that's a really insightful comparison because in some ways, Cohen songs really are out there in the world in a broad way, just like songwriters like Berlin's were.
Thanks.
I'll throw in one last little bit, which is that I think that Judy Collins covering Leonard Cohen, covering Joni Mitchell too at that same moment and helping start Joni Mitchell's career. Lou Reed not famously, if you read the Leonard Cohen archive, welcoming Leonard Cohen to the world of Andy Warhol, saying, you're great. It wasn't really a baby boomer 60s rock thing so much as it was strands of the cultural left that included the Beats and Hubert Selby, if you're a Lou Reed, or included Cafe Society, if you're Judy Collins. And over time, I think that there's been a growing audience investment in that long history of left-wing songmaking. And so we have lots of Velvet Underground covers now. We have lots of people doing work that might have at one point been seen as hopelessly bohemian and marginal, because there are more quasi-bohemian people than ever. So I do think that's part of the story here too.
Thank you.
For these last couple of, I'm just going to switch the order around because one of them is kind of a natural closing question. So I'm going to go to Ian Balfour first.
Hi. I'll just read what I wrote in the chat. So the excellent Indian or Anglo-Indian novelist Amit Chowdhury, oh, sorry, I forgot his name, Amit Chowdhury, said he wanted to grow up to be a Canadian singer-songwriter. And he grew up in Mumbai. So is there such a thing as a Canadian singer-songwriter, even if a bunch ended up living in LA and environs? Or is Cohen, as maybe distinct from Joni Mitchell and Neil Young, more a cosmopolitan Montrealer than a Canadian in the way that people from Anglo provinces are Canadian singer-songwriters? That could be addressed to a bunch of people. But
I suppose I have to answer this one as a Canadian. I do think that there is something different. I mean, Quebec is a distinct society for a range of reasons. But when speaking about Anglo Quebecers specifically, I do think that there is somewhat of a divide, because essentially when you're speaking about Anglo Quebecers, you're predominantly speaking of people from Montreal, and this idea of Montreal, which, when Cohen was sort of, being that pretentious guy and ladies and gentlemen introducing Leonard Cohen, this was at a time when Montreal was the big city in Canada. It was this important space, and so therefore would be kind of set aside from Halifax, Toronto, Vancouver, and then if you want to talk Winnipeg, Regina, Calgary, etc. So I think the idea
I might say that I grew up in Anglo Montreal in the 60s.
Okay,
So yeah.
And those of us who were in Anglo Montreal in the 1990s were very jealous of that experience, but because it was definitely a very where so much of the the idea of what Montreal is stems from that particular time. So I do think that as a representative of this very sort of particular time in Montreal's history and Canada's history, I would say that Cohen is kind of separate and apart. The question as to whether or not you can grow up to be a Canadian singer-songwriter, of course you can. And there's many examples. And whether you are born in Mumbai or you're born in Toronto, you can definitely grow up to be a Canadian singer-songwriter, but maybe you can't grow up to be Leonard Cohen.
Thanks. Maybe David has thoughts on the singer-songwriter thing, Canadian.
It's interesting because in a certain way, until I started seriously working on Cohen, I didn't really ever think of Neil Young or Joni Mitchell as particularly Canadian. I knew they were from Canada, but they seemed to me from LA, more or less. And so the idea of a specific group of Canadian singer-songwriters, I mean, clearly there are. I mean, we haven't mentioned Gordon Lightfoot, who was in Canada, maybe at least at some point more important or a better selling recording artist than any of these people. So there does seem to be something in Canada that yields this kind of performer, but I'm not sure what more I can say about it than that.
Thanks.
Oh, you'll be glad that you don't have to hear all of our theories about that. And for my final question, I'll go to Maurizio to ask your question about legacy.
Yes, thank you. So, I think it seems to me that all great artists sort of like inhabit a space beyond their work. So, my question is beyond the music, beyond the songs, perhaps even beyond the writing, what is the cultural legacy of Leonard Cohen, which is also maybe another way of asking where do we see him or hear him today?
I'll talk if no one else will, and then hopefully other people will talk. I think that we keep moving to different Leonard Cohen songs as touchdowns. I think it was Suzanne very early on. I think obviously it was Hallelujah for quite some time. I think these days the song that gets used a lot is Anthem, and the notion of there's a crack in everything, that's where the light gets in. That seems to be where the culture is living with Leonard Cohen right now. And I would have to do some work to try to figure out why that has become the equivalent of a dorm room poster for so many younger performers. But I do think it has. I think for some reason that's the current moment. I wouldn't put it past Leonard Cohen's legacy for there to be some TikTok like moment where some other line of Leonard Cohen's inspires interest in another song, because he's actually pretty coherent heard in a few second snippets. So let's go see who memes him next. So that'll be my final thought on the subject. Others?
I'm just thinking about Hallelujah because it was a song that everybody had to sing on the X Factor 100 years ago, so there were like endless performances of Hallelujah everywhere you went. And every time I heard it in whatever situation it might have been, I was like, are they listening to the word? Like, do they know what they're singing? It's always the most inappropriate cover of, and even like to this day, my sister in California and I will be sending each other like little video clips of, oh, here's a busker I heard in Turin singing Hallelujah, or here's somebody on the accordion playing. It's like everywhere. It's become this thing that, you know, that people know from cover versions, essentially. I don't think that most people who know the song go beyond, John Cale, Jeff Buckley, Rufus Wainwright, the X Factor people. Like, it would be difficult, I think, for people who learn those cover versions first to go back to Leonard Cohen's original, um, and hear the same thing that they think they're hearing in those cover versions. And it's for all we talked a lot about, the sort of the great zingers and the great couplets and the great, language craft that he had. These longer form songs, like Hallelujah goes on and on, right? It has a lot of depth to it. And that bit of it is just getting kind of stripped away, because it's been adopted into like everyday parlance. Like, people just kind of assume that it's this, hallelujah. I don't know what they think it is. So I'm sort of constantly reminded of, I don't want to say like that's the thing that is constantly forcing me to think about what he was trying to say, like trying to get back to what I kind of interpret as a meaning in the song initially, by hearing all these cover versions that kind of strip that meaning away. So, I mean, for me, it's a long way of saying that Hallelujah is kind of now so much a part of the background. It's like I hear it on the street corner, like walking out of my office almost every week. Um, and it's like, what I sort of, I don't want to say that I resent having to rethink my relationship with the song weekly. But I would say that it's one of the only songs I can think of where I'm constantly fighting to remind myself what the meaning of it was.
So I have an anecdote to follow it up. There is a version of the music for Hallelujah that's been new lyrics have been written explicitly Christian, which to me is kind of a cultural desecration. I don't mean this as an anti-Christian statement. I mean, to take that song and do that to it desecrates a work of art. But the second point is that I think as significant as Anthem right now is Tower of Song, and particularly when speaking about legacy, because Cohen is, of course, thinking about his legacy when he's writing that song. And the interesting thing about that is that clearly Cohen imagines himself as having a legacy. He's part of the Tower of Song. On the other hand, Hank Williams is 1,000 floors above him. So there's also a humility that he's projecting, which I believe is real. Cohen thinks of himself as having an impact, but also, like many artists, also thinks of himself to some extent as a failure, not as being not as great as he might have been or as other people are. The song to me is incredibly powerful.
And I think we'll have to leave it there. I want to thank David and all of the contributors for coming and presenting to us today. This has been a great conversation. I was tempted to go on forever. And I just want to remind everybody that we're back on February 4th with Jonathan Bernstein and Robert Moratz talking about Justin Townes Earle and talking about cowpunk in general. So please rejoin us then.
Thank you.